talk this morning is going to look at some ideas that Professor Gradeveld shared with you. When he was speaking about determinants of long-term economic growth, he was talking about traditional ways of thinking about where long-term growth comes from. And I think for many years, economists have concluded that capital accumulation is central to countries being able to achieve long-term growth and GDP per person. And I described this in our separate sessions, that appears to work for many countries that accumulate machinery and equipment and building new structures really can help an economy grow over time. And in fact, the models that have traditionally been developed in understanding economic growth would simply assume that capital, like other economic resources in a market system, would flow to its most valued use. And growth theorists would have come to the conclusion that capital would have its highest value in places that didn't have a whole lot of capital. After all, where would a tractor have more value in terms of overall productivity in a country that already has many tractors? So the addition of a tractor really contributes relatively little to additional output, or in a country where they don't really have any tractors. That first tractor can make a very large difference in terms of overall economic output. And so it was, for many years, naturally assumed that competitive forces, that the way that market economies work, would be that resources would naturally flow to those countries that were relatively underdeveloped, probably from countries that were relatively developed. After all, the return on capital would be greatest where it had its greatest productivity, and that would be where you'd see relatively little of this capital. So it turns out that the predictions of these economic growth models would be that countries that were relatively underdeveloped, that had GDP per capita, or income per person, that was substantially below places like the United States. As these economies evolve, you would see them grow more rapidly than, say, the U.S. economy. And so at some point, you see a convergence, if you will, of income per capita, of GDP per capita. Countries would catch up to the most advanced countries. And I think that you see this in some countries around the world. If you think about the growth of Singapore, if you think about the growth of South Korea, if you think about the growth of Hong Kong, you see that these forces have taken hold. But just as common, perhaps more common, is you see that countries continue to stay well below what the models would predict. Right? For every Singapore, for every I guess you can include China on that list. For every Hong Kong, for every South Korea, you can find many countries, a lot of them on the African continent, that have continued to experience levels or standard material living standards that remain well below country after country around the world. They don't seem to have been able to enjoy the sorts of resource flows that we would have incorporated in our economic models that would ultimately drive long-term growth. And so economists, this is probably about 20 or 25 years ago, they started asking, what's wrong with this model? What's the problem? And so there's been a renewed attention on forces of long-term economic growth. And some of the really bright minds in economics have turned their attention to understanding what I call, others would as well, the rules of the game, the institutional framework of a country in which growth is presumed to obtain. And so economists have started asking questions of, so why don't resources flow to these countries where they really, you can imagine, highly valued applications of these resources in their economy. So what I'll do here in the next half hour is to just try to talk through 7 or 8 items that economists have focused on that it turns out sort of need to be in place in order for an economy to be able to have this institutional setting where growth can obtain by having resources flow to the economy and have it used to efficient uses and ultimately trigger long-term growth. And it turns out some of these things are just not particularly trivial. That you really need to pay attention if you're a public policymaker, if you're really interested in how these countries do, you really need to pay attention to these things. So in the United States, for example, when we talk about the importance of property rights, I think we've been taking that for granted for many, many, many years. But it turns out that what we take for granted in the United States shouldn't be assumed as being what we observe in other countries. Okay? So I'll just go down through this list and maybe later on we'll be able to have a chance to have some questions. So what we now know is it's a really important function in a market system that you honor property rights. Okay? That people have the right to own private property, that they get to use it largely as they wish, and they get to get economic returns from the ownership of property. Okay? One's right to own that property is legally enforced, okay? So that governments can't take it away from you without somehow compensating you for your property. Okay? So it turns out that when you want to make long-term investments in the economy, that you will be able to keep the proceeds of those investments is part of what drives your desire to be willing to take the risks associated with economic investment. Okay? So along with the idea of ownership of private property, you also have to have a well-functioning legal system. Okay? So we have to make sure that those property rights are protected. And of course, private parties, when they make economic decisions and take risks, they sign contracts. Right? So they enter into contractual arrangements, and those contracts, sometimes the parties who enter into these arrangements, they have disputes with one another about what the contractual agreement was. And so it is very, very important for a legal system to make sure that it can adjudicate those disputes. Okay? So that when you sign a contract, you have the belief that it will be carried out, it will be done in a legal way. And so that is just incredibly important as an institutional framework for which all of these really important forces in the market system work. So economists continue to now emphasize the importance of property rights. Well, a second really key institutional part of the institutional framework is how the economic system is organized. Well, you can well imagine that economists think that organizing productive activity around a market system is typically the most efficient way to allocate and distribute productive resources. And so one of the nice lines that one of the popular principles of economics books has in it, this author has been his name is Greg Mankiw. He has been a presidential advisor and has been involved in various policy roles. And he has several key principles of economic thinking in his Principles of Economics book. And one of his key principles is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. And it turns out, I think, that for attainment of long-term growth, I think there's large agreement around that statement, right? That organizing economic activity around markets is really, really important, okay? When you organize economic activity around markets, you create an incentive structure that rewards innovation and efficiency, right? This means that, this means in markets that we do things like we have patents. So when people take risks, when they spend their resources to try to innovate, and innovation is so central to long-term growth, right? That those efforts to innovate, turns out that a lot of those efforts are going to be unsuccessful. Okay? But when you're ultimately successful in innovation, and you put all these resources into this, right, it's very important to be able to capture the benefits associated with those considerable efforts, right? In a strong patent policy, and I understand that there's a patent policy in Bulgaria, we heard a little bit about that last night, right? But a strong patent policy can help encourage that kind of that kind of innovative result, right? And a market economy needs to have these types of things where people are rewarded for their efforts, so that somehow the return you get out of the system is related to the efforts you put in, right? People will make these efforts. So I think that's part of it. So part of the market system, encouragement of entrepreneurship. Now, Professor O'Neill in several lectures is talking about entrepreneurship, the importance of that, right? I mean, entrepreneurs, they take risks, they organize productive activity, right? When they do it successfully, the rewards are profits, right? Profits allocate resources in efficient ways in a market economic system, okay? But also understand, because these entrepreneurs take risks, they're likely to make bad choices at times, right? So it turns out that the penalty for not rewarding or for not allocating economic resources in an efficient way is that you sustain economic losses, right? If you do this enough with these economic losses, then your firm may go bankrupt, right? But it's clear in a market system, that signal that you misaligned, that you misallocated scarce resources, that market signal of failure or of economic losses is so central to understanding how a market system works and how resources are allocated efficiently, that in a well-functioning market system, those signals are apparent, right? And so you see these, so that the profit motive is so key to understanding the institutional framework for how a market system allocates resources in a way that promotes long-term growth, right? And so there's certainly plenty of examples of where and we've had recent ones in the U.S., unfortunately. There are some examples where we've rewarded profits, but we haven't allowed people who have made bad choices and misallocated resources to experience losses. And frankly, this creates problems in the marketplace, right? We don't get the important signals. When you don't let those signals play out in an economic system, it turns out that you're likely to get long-term resource misallocation, and that's something that we have to be very careful about. Now, I have also on this list the importance of things like copyrights, right? In societies, we have to have meaningful thought about what the economic role of government is, right? So we probably need to have a limited role. Talk about those profits, talk about losses. I think we have to have some sort of limited use of industrial policy, right? So that markets are probably a good way to allocate resources, but having policymakers determine how those resources are allocated, they're not likely to respond to the same key signals you see in a market system. For balance between equity concerns and efficiency concerns, I think these are all things that you see that are really central to long-term growth in an institutional setting that promotes long-term growth in a market setting. But I do have in there also a line that we do have examples where markets can fail, right? This notion of market failure. So there are times when the line governments can sometimes improve economic outcomes. That's also one of these key principles in Dr. Man's book. So governments can play a role, they do play a role. There's times when markets fail. We talk about things like when pollution exists, markets don't deal well with things like pollution. In my other sessions, I talk about situations where there's knowledge spillovers, and so markets don't allocate enough resources to economic development and growth and development, and so there's probably a role for government. So to understand that to promote long-term growth, we think that organizing around a market system is key to doing that, but there will be a role for government. Okay? And that occurs in cases where we experience market failure. The only thing I would caution about when we think about that is that because you can identify episodes of market failure, it doesn't mean, sometimes people don't get this message right, it doesn't mean failure of the market system. So in 2007, certainly in 2008, in the U.S., we had a great example of some form of market failure. I guess there's a lot of failures to go along with it, but it's now, of course, known as a financial crisis, and it accompanied a very deep recession in the United States. And it appears that over the 2000s, we had been allocating resources to building housing probably at a rate that probably wasn't sustainable, and we now had this sort of bubble that developed in our housing markets. And at some point, when you see a bubble develop, right, at some point, you have to let the air out of the bubble, right? And sometimes letting the air out of the bubble, if you think of it as a balloon, right? Sometimes you can do that in a real orderly way, but sometimes you just prick a hole in it and it just blows up, right? And I think we pricked a hole in the bubble and it just blew up, right? And this is part of what happened with the financial crisis in the U.S. Now, part of that story, there's plenty of blame to go around, but part of that story is market failure, right? I would say that we probably some way mispriced risk instruments in the U.S. and so we weren't achieving equilibrium in the marketplace, right? I think some people concluded that there's something fundamentally wrong with the market system as a result of that episode. I just caution people to remind themselves that because you can find examples of market failure doesn't mean that you should discard this very, very important system for allocating resources in a way that is most likely to promote long-term growth. To use the market system as a key way to organize resources, to find examples of market failure doesn't mean the whole system is failed. So a third notion on our list, and I know that Professor O'Neill is talking about this in his sessions, is just how important it is for people to have economic freedom, right? So for them to be able to make decisions on their own about how they want to acquire resources, what they wish to do with those resources. And so, for example, Jim has, when he talks about an index of economic freedom that an organization collects information on for countries around the world. And in this index of economic freedom, they talk about the importance of the rule of law. They talk about the importance of limited government. They talk about regulatory efficiency, about open markets, right? And so the notion, so when you think about economic freedom, the notion of enforcing property rights, rights, the notion of freedom from corruption, limited government spending, fiscal freedoms, right? Business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom. These are all central to the notion of being able to make decisions that are in an institutional framework that are very, very important for economic growth to obtain. So related to some of those things, just a few more points here. So we also know that political stability, lack of corruption, transparency in policy making, limited government budget deficits, right? These things are probably all important in the institutional framework as we think about what sort of settings where we can experience long-term economic growth, right? When you have a really highly unstable political setting, right, where people, those who would invest in an economy, really are unsure what the political will of enforcing property rights is, right? When you have that kind of instability in a country, you really see, you see people being very hesitant to make the key investments in the economy. They're just simply not sure whether or not their investments, their risks will be rewarded going forward if political decision-making changes. So having a reasonably stable political environment is really, really key in the institutional framework in order to attract the important investment flows that we think are central to long-term growth. And of course, corruption in government is just something that just drains resources, right? Right? In a market economic system, resources have to flow to their most valued uses as well as possible, right? In a corrupt environment, that simply doesn't happen, right? People in power simply corrupt the use of those resources and use them in a way that on their own behalf, but not for the behalf of the people, right? So political corruption, and by the way, that's such an important story of why Africa has been so mired in misery for so long, that corrupt governments one after another, misappropriating resources, misallocating resources, in countries who by and large just not even have a chance, right, to enjoy some of the benefits of long-term economic growth and development. Right? The importance of transparency in policy making, the importance of not letting political decision makers make deals behind doors in ways that aren't open for the people to understand. Right? So when political decisions are often made by relatively few people, they're often made in a way that they're not representing the public interest, that they're representing some special interest. And it seems pretty unlikely that that's the institutional framework where you're going to see long-term economic growth develop. We talked about limited government budget deficits. So in my country, in the United States, we've been spending something like $1.3 trillion more than we take in taxes every year, right? And that's something that I think all observers will agree is not a sustainable outcome for the U.S. or any other country. That's about that's like 8% of our overall economy we're overspending right now. And one of the real challenges that we're having as we think about long-run growth in the U.S. is we need to somehow get that budget deficit, this temptation to spend more than we bring in the form of taxes. Right? This is such a tempting thing for political decision makers, but it's not likely over the long haul. In short periods of time, it may be optimal, but in the long run, it's not likely to be the type of framework where you're going to achieve long-term economic growth. Right? We know how important it is when we think about economic growth. If we're going to experience capital formation over time, you need to save, right? You can't spend all your resources in the current period. You need to save for the future. When you're running deficits like, say, the U.S. is,
дефицит, както в САЩ,
again, 8% of our overall economy, you're certainly not saving for the future, right? This is public dis-saving.
Това е всъщност обратното на
And
спестяване.
that's something that is not long-run sustainable. And of course, this experience isn't isolated just to the United States. Some of the tensions that are being experienced in the European monetary zone, one thinks about the challenges of your neighbor Greece. And understand that the way that a government's public debt becomes the size that it is that countries continue to spend more than they take in tax revenues. Right? So every year that you spend more than you take in tax revenues, you have to create debt instruments to finance that. Right? And so at the end of the year, we usually think of there being a fiscal year or a calendar year, but at the end of the year, the deficit goes away and you open up a new year's books and you start spending relative to taxes, and then a year later, you look back and you see that you've run a deficit. But understand what remains is that you had to sell public debt in order to finance deficits. Right? So in the U.S., for example, our public debt is something on the order, our national debt is something on the order of $15.7 trillion. It's just about the size of our GDP. Right? And if you want to think about how did we ever get to have $15.7 trillion of national debt, that's every year since the U.S. became a country, since the American Revolution. That's every year that we've run deficits, we've had to finance it by creating debt. Right? What gets to be a concern, because at some point you have to be able to finance this debt. So you're borrowing from the future. Right? So when the ratio of debt to GDP gets particularly high, people start getting concerned about the long-term future of the economy. Now, my reading of the numbers here is actually relatively favorable for your country. My data source, anyway, from a World Factbook, suggests that your public debt is only, Bulgaria's public debt is only 17.5% of your GDP. Right? And so that's not bad. You know what Greece's is? You know what the share of public debt relative to GDP is in Greece?
Знаете ли в Гърция какво е това отношение на държавния дълг към брутния вътрешен продукт?
So you're 17.5%, Greece is?
5% в Гърция колко? Знае ли някой?
Yeah, this data set said it's 165%.
165%.
That's a big difference in terms of potential for your economy going forward. Right? So while your neighbor is going to have to manage with public policy and cutting back on resources and austerity programs, while your neighbor is going to have to really restrict what its economy is going to be able to do in the future to deal with this debt, you've got a lot of potential, right? Because you haven't borrowed from the future as much as so many other economies. I think that speaks well for the Bulgarian future. A fifth determinant of economic growth, as we think about institutions, is, and I think we don't put this on the list often enough, is the importance of well-functioning financial markets. So if investment in capital is central to achieving long-term growth in countries around the world, then that investment can only be undertaken if those who have investment opportunities are able to borrow, if they are able to access funds. Okay, so when you hear that it's really important for countries to save for the future, that saving is important because that becomes what's available for those who wish to make economic investments. Right? So that's fine, right? Save more, invest more, build more capital, achieve more growth. But where economies have a problem is when you have difficulty bringing the savers together with the investors. Right? If financial markets aren't some way efficiently bringing these savers and investors together, there's no way for the financial capital to get allocated to its most valued uses. Right? And you don't end up having the flow of economic investment and capital formation that is central to growth. So a financial system that somehow is broken down where savers and investors can't come together, right, and achieve agreements as to making these funds available at a market rate of interest, or where savers will get a return from their savings, investors will be able to access this financial capital. I think we now know that it's not trivial to make sure that the system is well functioning. Okay? And so developing a strong financial system, and by the way, making sure that it has all of these other characteristics of transparency, accountability, that you don't have fraud, that you have all the right forces in place. I mean, that's really, really key. But what financial markets do is they bring savers together with borrowers, right? And when that's done right, that's what fuels the capital investment that drives long-term growth. So that means pay attention to your banks, right? Make sure that your banks are well functioning. Make sure that they're responding to the right set of incentives. It means thinking about other financial markets. We think about the importance of bond markets or debt markets, right? Think about the importance of stock markets. Okay, the other way, so there are various ways to raise financial capital, right? There are in the U.S., we have other key financial intermediaries, and so making sure that those are well-functioning components of a financial system, that is key to having a well-functioning economic system. And of course, here again, we can go back to our financial crisis in 2008 and see how important a well-functioning financial system is for the performance of the overall economy. Right? In that case, there's little doubt that our recession was directly triggered by the weakness of our financial system. And I noted in that bullet point the importance of pricing in risk. Right? So modern tools of finance allow for parties in the financial system to try to manage the level of financial risk that they experience. And so there are any number of financial instruments. Some of them are insurance products. Insurance is that which people use to try to deal with risk. But there are also some fairly exotic financial instruments that we create. You might have heard of financial derivatives. Instruments like this that we create to attempt to manage risk. As I noted earlier, I think that many observers would argue that if you really think about the financial crisis told us something about a market failure, a failure of the financial system, I think it was that we probably didn't price these risk products at their equilibrium, their long-term equilibrium level. So we were doing things like insuring companies, parties against default risk, and making those insurance policies as you were way too cheap to buy. right? And so if people are taking out those insurance policies and their financial instruments end up going south on us, on you, and you end up having to use the insurance policy, then you have to question whether or not the party that provided the insurance will be able to make good on their agreement that they were going to provide insurance for you. And so when the U.S. government had to bail out the firm AIG, right? It turns out that AIG has made a lot of bad bets about insuring future financial flows. And it turned out that they had well overpromised what they could insure. And they did it in part because they were getting a favorable price for their products. So you have to be, I think you have to be really thoughtful about what your financial sector looks like. And I think that's probably part of your future. I don't know enough about the Bulgarian financial system, but it's probably in its relatively early stages of development, and I think you have to be reasonably thoughtful about that. So, for example, in China, we know that China is growing very rapidly, right? They go through a little bit of growth spurts and then they slow down a little bit, but it's a country that fundamentally has the potential to grow very rapidly. They have a lot of human resources that aren't being used to sustain long-term growth, and those resources easily will get allocated to the marketplace going forward. One of the things that in my judgment, will constrain China's long-term economic growth is they have not yet, while their industrial sector in many places around the country has grown very rapidly, right? They really haven't developed alongside that a financial system that meets all the requirements for a really healthy economic system in the long run, right? And so I think that at some point they're really going to regret that their banking sector and that their financial sector hasn't developed at the same pace as the industrial sector has, right? And I know Chinese authorities are thinking about these things, but one of the problems in developing your financial sector is the importance of transparency, the importance of making sure incentives are correctly aligned with the overall economic ideals. Again, making sure that these institutions are well functioning, making sure they're capitalized, not dependent on government decisions, that sort of stuff. And I think that's part of the challenge for a country like China going forward. But it will be central, necessary for China to achieve its long-term growth potential, to be able to have a domestic financial system that they simply don't have right now. And so when China accumulates all these trade surpluses, certainly against the U.S., you ask yourself what happens to the financial flows when the financial flows that result from these surpluses. Right? And what ends up happening, of course, is that China gets these surpluses and then they turn around and invest them in financial markets, but it's not their own financial markets, right? It's the financial markets in the U.S., right? So that they're buying a lot of U.S. debt. But you can imagine in the long run, that will seem like an unsatisfactory way to allocate financial resources. In the long run, they will want to keep those resources at home in their domestic financial industry. I talk about China, but many countries in early stages of more rapid development will have to think this way as they think about their financial system. The sixth topic here is the importance of infrastructure. Right? So it turns out to be really important. If goods are going to flow to their most valued uses, right? They need to have a way to get there. Right? So they need to have roadways. They need to have ports. They need to have airports. So that do you know this book, The World is Flat?
Тази книга "Света е плосък".
Do you know this book?
Чули сте The World is Flat?
The World is Flat. There's a book by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat.
Така се казва това заглавието на книгата.
And what The World is Flat basically says, if you haven't read the book, what the World is Flat basically says is that a flat world means that resources just flow from one place to the other seamlessly, without borders, without anything.
Без граници, без никаква пречка.
In many ways, you can think about this in economic terms. as the efficiency that we hold so dear, that resources flow to their most valued uses, and it doesn't matter if those, if they started in the US and ended in India or ended in China, right? It's easy that this flat world doesn't create any obstacles for resource flow. And so, I remember when I was reading this book, The World is Flat, it's probably about 350 or 400 pages. And this author, he's a very good journalist, and so he spends about the first 40% of the book describing all of the ways in which the world is flat, right? And pointing to examples in Bangalore, and pointing to examples in Beijing, and you name it, right? A long list of great examples. And then at some point, about 40% or 50% through the book, having just told us how flat the world was, he says, and by the way, the world isn't flat. So he reverses course basically and said, here are the ways in which the world isn't flat. Right? And so, for all the stories I can talk about a flat world related to parts of India, the largest parts of India simply, the world isn't flat, right? And partly because they are constrained by infrastructure, right? There's no way for these resources to be flat, right? There's no way for them to find their most valued use. Now, that constrains long-run potential, right? If you don't have these simple things in place, ports, airports, roads, information technologies, there's just no way for the world to be flat. So whenever we can talk about the industrial centers in China, where the world is flat, but we shouldn't forget about all of the other, the rural areas there where there's a peasant economy, and they're not participating in this dynamic economic growth. Right? And part of why they're not is because of this institutional impact. Two other areas. Right? Well, so the simulation, the game that we played yesterday afternoon, that was the grab bag game, right? So that was meant to show you that people receive value from being able to enter into voluntary trade, being able to exchange with one another. Right? Trade is a positive sum game. Right? Parties will only enter into a voluntary exchange if they expect to benefit. So, you might remember when we noted that a couple people assigned a lower value for round 2 for their items than they did for round 1. I said, uh-oh. Right? How could that happen? See, economists would say that really can't happen. If you, we didn't actually know whether you traded, but if you had traded, we presume that you would not have traded and made yourself worse off.
Да, не знам, реално ако търгувате, дали ще търгувате по начин, по който да загубите. Едва ли е така?
Well, what's true for an individual here is true for an economy. Openness to trade is really, really important, right? It turns out as countries open themselves up for trade, there's little question that they make their citizens better off, right? Understand that trade doesn't benefit everybody. Right? There are going to be some people who are made worse off by being subject to more foreign competition. Right? We know that to be the case. I think what you have to be very careful about is not letting that tempt you into protecting domestic industries, right? Unless there are strong national security interests to do so. Right? It would be, I think the last number I saw, when you ask professional economists a question like how to respond to a question,
икономист,
trade is good for a nation.
търговията е полезна за
I think George referenced this yesterday. The last number I saw, 96% of economists agree with that
96% от икономистите, последната цифра е,
It's up to 99%. So I mean, if you're a card-carrying economist, you really believe in trade. But you understand why this is, right? Because even though there may be some people who lose from trade, the gains are large enough to compensate those who lose and have more left over for others. Right? It's not to say that you do compensate those who lose, but that's what economics is all about, right? When the gains are large enough to compensate those who lose, then, and larger than that, right, it's economically efficient to pursue on down that course. And so, and if you see country around the world, right, who have opened up to trade, I think you see this is very central to their achieving long-term growth potential. You'll recall George started yesterday with the production possibilities curve. Right? And so part of what he had you think about initially about long-term growth was in long-term growth we're able to make attainable that which was not attainable. Right? That you're able to produce outside of that production possibilities curve. One of the fundamental applications of the production possibilities curve is that it tells us a story about the benefits associated with specializing according to comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. Do you know this? Comparative advantage? Right? That it basically says that parties should specialize in the production for which they are the low opportunity cost producers. Right. It's actually fundamentally, it's actually pretty easy to show that when countries specialize, and then they specialize in producing the item for which they are the low opportunity cost producer, and then trade for the items that are more costly for them to produce. What you fundamentally can achieve is to be able to consume outside of the production possibilities frontier. Okay? And so you can get there, you can get outside the production possibilities frontier, not by having more resources, right? Not by having better technology, but just by making smarter decisions as it relates to specializing according to comparative advantage. It's a huge principle, right? That you can expand beyond what you could do if you tried to do it all alone. Trade is central to long-term growth, to that institutional framework that drives long-term growth. And I know limited protectionism. It's be very careful about protecting industries. In doing so, you're likely to be protecting inefficiencies. And it's likely to be damaging for long-term resource allocation. So the last point is how important monetary stability is. Right? It just turns out that countries have to be really, really careful about doing things like printing more money to try to make their people better off. Right? I mean, this means having a fairly low inflation environment, having reasonably stable rates of exchange, right? You know, you can't say enough. Right? I must say that my freshman students at university, right? If I ask them what they wish they had more of, they almost always say more money. Right? And so And some of you might do that too. I would like more money.
Също така ще отговорят, искам повече пари.
But you see, that's not society's answer to its well-being, right? Printing more money can't make more scarce goods and services available. Right? If you think about it, if we could make society better off just by printing more money, we would have thought about that long ago. Right? We would have done things like what Zimbabwe did and just put more zeros on their currency. We might not even stop till we got to $100 trillion. A $100 trillion note. It probably bought 2 eggs. Right? And so it's silly if you really think about it, right? I mean, yes, right? If the helicopter's flying around and dropping bags this evening and it drops a bag of more money on my doorstep, I'm going to think that's a pretty good thing. That additional money will be small relative to everybody else's the money supply, and I won't drive up the prices of goods and services with my extra money. But obviously the helicopter can't be dropping bags of money on everybody's doorstep. Right? We'll just go into a marketplace where goods and services and technology is fixed at any point in time, and we'll just bid up the prices, and all you'll see is inflation. And so that countries have to control those inflationary pressures, that you don't give in to the temptation of trying to pay for things by printing money. That's pretty important for the institutional framework for long-term growth. Now, oh, I'm just about out of time. Okay. Well, let me leave you with a glimpse of how different long-term economic performance can look like based on paying attention to these institutional items, these rules of the game. Right? When you follow the right rules, your economy is likely to have at least a chance to experience long-term growth. When you follow the wrong rules, these wrong rules might be not having political stability, not using a market system, having political corruption, not honoring property rights, these kinds of things. When you follow the wrong rules, then your economy really doesn't have a chance. So imagine a place where the population is largely the same, a place where north of a line, right, the population is largely the same as south of a line, right, where they basically have the same natural resources, they have the same climate, all that. But imagine a place where south of the line, they have this institutional framework set up in the right way, and north of the line they do not. Imagine what economic activity looks like in such a place. Now we can measure the economic activity, and sure we have these data sources that allow us to say what's going on in the north and what's going on in the south. But one of the interesting recent developments that economists have found, they've worked with geographers to try to get a sense of what economic development looks like around the world by using satellite images of evening light intensity. Right? So there's these satellite images, and you see lights coming from really populated, developed parts of the world, right? And there's parts of the world that are dark. So I want to show you something. You know what that's a picture of?
Виждали сте такива снимки?
We don't want this computer at risk. Who knows what that's a picture of? Who knows? the left-hand side picture is of 1992, and the right-hand side picture is of 2008. I hope we can get rid of that. So what's that a picture of?
Откъде е снимката?
Did somebody say Korea?
Някой каза Корея, да, точно така.
South Korea,
Южна Корея,
North Korea.
Северна.
South Korea, 1992.
92 година, Южна
More
Корея,
light intensity.
още повече
That's a
светлини.
proxy for. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you can see that you get more light intensity over the 16-year period from 1992 to 2008. So researchers say that's a visual image, if you will, of economic growth and development in the area where they have these institutional things worked out. But at night, North Korea is basically dark.
А нощем Северна Корея по принцип е тъмна и си остава така.
And the people are largely the same, right? The resources are the same. But what's the problem here? It's those institutions. And I think that's a pretty dramatic way to think about what economic growth looks like. When you pay attention to some of these rules and games.
Но наистина това е много ясна, отчетлива картина. Почивки?
Oh, okay. I guess we're on a break. If you have questions, I'll
Ще остана.